welcome back to McDaniel Motorsports. Today we're going to teach you how to change chains and sprockets on a dirt bike. Our test mule here is a 2021 KTM 450 SXF. This is a pure motocross bike, and we ride in the sand and in the dirt, so we have an extra set of wheels to run in the sand and obviously for the dirt. So to help us save time, we are actually having two separate wheel sets. These stock ones that are on the bike right now are going to become the sand set, and when you have different sprockets, you want to keep the chains for each sprocket set. So we're going to allow this sprocket set to become the sand set. So we're going to show you how to do that. So hang on tight. We're going to show you how to do it. Okay, so when we're changing chains and sprockets, it's important to have the right tools. These bikes are all metric. Most motocross bikes are. So what we have to do is remove the rear tire. We have to find the master link in the chain, which I typically will clock right here, and I'll show you why in a minute. And then also, you either need a buddy or an impact wrench to remove this bolt here, because it's actually threaded into one of the drive axles. So you can have a buddy sit on the bike and hold the brake, or we'll show you how to do it with an impact wrench, because typically these are Loctited, or they should be. So let's get started. Okay, so I have the rear axle nut loosened and removed. You always want to keep your adjuster blocks on the side that they belong on. It's important. And I found the master link, and I have this guy along with the retaining clip and a little pile here. So I'm going to slide this axle out. It's also important, you want to have your bike in a neutral position on the stand, meaning both tires should be off the ground, like so. And so when you remove the tire in the back, it's actually going to go back on the front. But we're going to be replacing both wheels and tires, so the bike will need to be in a neutral position, otherwise it'll fall forward. So here we go. I'm going to remove the axle, slide it back out. I haven't bought new sprocket bolts. These theoretically should be replaced every time you take them off. They are recommended to be replaced in every time you use them, but nobody does. But I feel compelled to tell you guys that. Alright, so we're going to remove the rear sprocket off this wheel because we're going to use these bolts. It's important that you don't try to loosen it with this ratchet. It's a Torx bit, so sometimes they will round out, so I always leave it in there to hold it, but use the wrench on the bottom to loosen them up, and they should have Loctite on them, so they're always a little stubborn. Once you get it loose, you can use the Torx side. Just get them loose enough to manage. Next, we're going to remove the rotor. It's pretty straightforward. Just thought we'd show you guys how to do it. It's real simple. It's important to know that when you replace a rotor, if you have two different rotors on the same set of brake pads in the caliper, the brake pads need to be seated into both rotors. So some would say that you should keep the pads with the rotor, just so when they groove a home into the rotor itself, they won't have to be burned in. The pads make a groove into the rotor, and even though they're machined flat, they still start to groove a little bit, especially with the sand or dirt. So just be careful when you start with a fresh rotor or fresh pads. You need to seat those pads before you start getting after it. Otherwise you won't have the braking that your bike should have. So I thought it would be worth mentioning. You don't have to remove a rotor to swap the drivetrain or the sprocket and chain. We're just doing it because we're taking this off to swap it onto our new set of wheels. Okay, so we've got the new rotor on our new wheel. I should mention that using Loctite is a dire need. Now, no one wants their rotor to come off while riding. That's obviously bad. But I would caution you, don't use red Loctite. You'll be married to it, and lots of bad things have happened. I would only use Loctite in a flywheel situation or something that's ultra dangerous. But you can always check these bolts. But blue Loctite is our go-to. And just a little dab will do you, really. Just want to make sure you're dabbing it where the threads will engage. A lot of people make that mistake and dab it too high, and the threads won't have any thread locker in them. So start them by hand, run them down by hand, and resist the urge to use an impact gun for this particular method. You can cross thread and strip it out, and basically you're gonna be up a creek. Alright, so we've got our rotor on. All the bolts have just a little dab of Loctite on them, on the threads that are going to engage into the hub. There is a torque spec for these, but it's in inch-pounds. I don't have an inch-pound torque wrench, so I've always had pretty good luck with just snugging them down and checking them. One thing I would caution you on, if your bolt is loose and you've Loctited it, you're going to have to take it back out and reapply the Loctite, because once you've moved the bolt, the Loctite seal has been broken. So when you're installing these bolts or tightening them, do it in a crisscross pattern, just like tightening a wheel on a car. And don't go full torque the first time around. Just ease into it. These are tiny little bolts, so you don't need much. And so now you've got them all snugged down. Redo in a crisscross fashion. And then go around one more time. Just make sure they're tight. Don't have to crank on them. And I would recommend using a 1/4 inch ratchet for this. There's no reason to use a 3/8 drive for this, because the bolt is just so small that it could break, and then you're up a creek again. Moving on to the sprocket. Okay, now we've got our sprocket in hand. I'm going to make sure it fits first and foremost. It looks like there's many different holes here, but they're not acorn countersunks. So the ones that have acorns on them are obviously the ones you're going to use. I believe all the rest of the holes are just for saving weight. The sprocket fits nicely, and I should also mention that I'm re-gearing this bike. I'm going to go with a 14 tooth counter sprocket, which is the one in the front, and a 52 in the rear. A lot of the reputable magazines that I read recommend this gearing for this particular bike. So if you ever wonder what gearing should I use on my bike, take it from the pros. Look up Motocross Action Mag. They have tons and tons of testing hours, and they post every little tweak they do to every single bike and every single year, and it's free. So why not take it from the pros, the guys that actually test these bikes for a living, and they race. They don't just play ride. So who better to give you advice than people who race these motorcycles? So again, we're going to reuse these bolts. I don't recommend it. The factory recommends replacing them. It's really use your discretion. A little bit of Loctite, drop them in. So we're going to move on to removing the chain. So we're not going to reuse this chain with our new drivetrain. It's really important to know that chains and sprockets become a matched pair. A lot of people don't know that, but it's been said that if you put a used chain on 2 new sprockets, it'll ruin the sprockets immediately. So whether or not that's true, a lot of guys contest that because of using steel sprockets. Steel sprockets live a lot longer, but they're just slightly heavier, so you won't find steel sprockets on any race bikes. However, just play riders like we are, you could probably get by with them, and the problem is the chains still don't live very long with all the dirt and grime going through them, so it's really a debatable subject. So here we go. I'm going to go on and remove this counter sprocket now, and because I'm upsizing the counter sprocket, I'm going to remove this little guard here just to make it easier on me. And I'm also going to show you how to remove this bolt from this sprocket without a buddy. Just going to move this guy out of the way. And I would caution you, using this impact, you want to make sure the bolt is the right size before you start whacking on it with the wrench. Excuse me while I get another socket. So I got a 17 fitting the socket, making sure it's the right one. And this should only just take a quick blip. So here we go. Put it in gear. Now it's in gear, so we should be able to blast it off real quick. The reason we have to use this is because if you just use it on a wrench or just try to remove it with the wrench, it would just spin unless your buddy's willing to come over and help you. You also want to make sure that that washer, the cup faces towards the sprocket, and you can also see that there's Loctite on this bolt from when I previously changed that sprocket. So we're going to take this guy off. It's a spline fit, and a lot of people also don't know that these are steel sprockets regardless. They're all steel, as opposed to the rear sprockets, and this is called the counter sprocket. So if you ever hear counter sprocket, that means the front sprocket. So we're going to get the taller sprocket. This is a 13, so I'm going to use a 14. So after you've removed your counter sprocket, it's a good time to go in there and clean up all the goo from all the chain lube flinging around in there. And then you also want to clean up that washer and take a wire brush to the counter sprocket bolt just to get the threads cleaned up just enough. Doesn't have to be perfect. But again, you want to use blue Loctite and just enough for the thread engagement, just like that. And again, the conical part of the washer goes towards the sprocket itself. So you've got your bolt and washer assembly, and then a lot of these sprockets will have a shoulder machined into the backside. So you want to make sure that shoulder goes towards the engine. And they've also printed the number of teeth and the manufacturer's name on the sprocket too. So when you go to replace your chain and sprocket again, you'll know exactly what size to get. And don't worry about the washer not seating onto the shoulder of the bolt until you get it closer to snug. It's gonna rock and roll around on there until you get it in. And also, when you're going up a size in Sprocket, you also want to make sure there's no binding, or the gears, the teeth aren't chewing on your chain guides. A lot of times there will be some interference that you may have to use a Dremel or cut it with a razor blade in order for it to move freely. Now, I'm going to run this guy in with the impact wrench. With the torque wrench, I'm just buzzing it on there, but we're going to do a final torque on it once we have the chain on it. And I have a helper here that he can sit on the bike and hold the brake while I torque it. Torque spec on this particular item is really important, so you want to make sure you do it, and you also want to do it before the Loctite dries. A lot of people, when they make that mistake and they've broken that seal, so it's kind of pointless if you let the Loctite dry and then you move the bolt again. So I'm going to refasten this counter sprocket guard. And all these bikes now, I'm pretty sure, I know all KTM, Husqvarna, and gas bikes, the KTM website has all these manuals for free now, when they used to cost over $100 each. So it's really cool that they're doing that for us, especially as guys that do our own work. So anyway, so moving on back to the swing arm, a lot of grease. If you grease your axle, and you should, will build up in these slots here, and it's real normal, but you want to make sure you clean it all out, because obviously grease attracts dirt, and you could possibly get a incorrect chain adjustment reading if you have any dirt built up in here from riding. So just get it clean. Doesn't have to be antiseptically clean, but clean is good as far as we're concerned, so it's real important. Plus it looks good, especially when it's sitting on the stand. It's a good opportunity to get in here and make the bike look new again. So okay, there's also the rotor, the caliper will come forward, and it comes out of that slot there, and you can set it aside, and you can check wear and tear on this little post right here on the swing arm. The caliper actually is designed to not be a solid mount, so it'll actually rock a little bit, and I can show you that in a sec. But this little post right here is something that you got to keep an eye on. The wear and tear, it starts chewing into this, and bikes that are long in the tooth, they will have an extra amount of play, so just keep an eye on that. And then again, obviously make sure your surfaces are clean here. And then of course, last but not least, your axle needs to be rid of the old grease and grime. We will be reapplying new grease to this every time you do it. Alright, so we've got our axle greased up. It's got a light film of grease. You don't need to go overboard. Just a light film of some good synthetic grease. And keep that off the ground until you get the tire in there. Don't forget to put your caliper back on. See how it indexes into that, and then it slides back. Okay guys, we're back. Had a little snafu with the wheels, more in particularly the spacer inside here wouldn't allow my axle to go through, so I had to do some surgery and remove the seals and the bearings, which capture that sleeve that was in there that wouldn't allow me to put my axle through. Check when you're doing this, check with your parts counter in the manufacturer of your bike, that they'll be able to look up the parts fiche and make sure that you're getting the right application. These bearings are not all interchangeable, and there's a different range of years for each spacer, so your application may be different than mine, obviously. I do believe that in 2023 model years they changed the size of the axle to a smaller diameter, so hopefully that helps you. I'm going to get this wheel back on the bike and we're going to cut a chain. I wanted to mention that you guys, before you put these spacers back in, just coat them with a little bit of grease on the inside, because these actually do, these are stuck, but the seal actually rotates around them, so it's good to put a little bit of grease on there to seal it up, especially if you're a pressure washing guy like myself. Just keeps water out of there and prevents water from getting inside the bearing. So put a little grease on there, and it's important also to make sure your spacer doesn't walk around inside the seal too. So if you have the wrong spacer, and again, as I always say, if it doesn't feel right, it probably isn't. So we're going to get this wheel back on. Carefully threading the needle with the rotor in between the pads. Got that guy. When you're pushing it in, you want to make sure you rotate it around just to spread the grease evenly. And don't forget, you can actually index this guy one way or the other in order to do different big changes, I guess you could say. This would be the longer edge, and you can actually rotate it to actually bring it closer to the center line of the bike. Got the axle in there. I like to keep my adjusters from the side that they belong, on their respective sides, and hand tighten the axle nut just for now until we get the chain length set. Alright, so I've got my new chain here. I'm gonna feed it through, because we have to size the chain before we can cut it. So I always keep the slack in my right hand here as I pull it through. Once I get the chain fed through, I can actually feed it to the counter sprocket, and at that point it'll pull through. Now I'm going to feed it through the chain guide on the bottom. And you can see how it came through. And now we can figure out what size and what links to remove. Alright, we're back. So now we're going to decide which link or where we're going to cut the chain. And if I bring you over here to look, you can see that if you look at the top of the link, you have to remove this guy and this guy if you want to keep this to be the end of your chain. So I've made the mistake of taking this guy, or wanting the chain to be this long, and cutting that and then losing a link. So don't be a me. Make sure that you think this through and measure 3 times, cut once kind of deal. You just want to be sure which one you're removing and how the outcome is going to be. So super important. These chains are not cheap. So now what I like to do is wipe off the chain lube so I can get a marker on there. Forgive me, my camera guy's out today. And so what I'm going to do is mark this guy with a Sharpie and this guy. And just in case it gets wiped off, I like to put an X there just to make sure I am not cutting the wrong one. Alright, so we've got our chain on the table. Take it off the bike already. So I like to use the bag to keep the rest of the chain from getting contaminated from any grinding particles or anything like that. But I'm going to use the old school way of cutting a chain. Most of you may not have seen this technique, which is why I'm going to use it. They do make chain cutters, but I have a hard time with the pins breaking. So I've got one of those, but today I'm going to show you the old school way of doing this. So really all you need is a grinder with some sort of grinding wheel. We use flap disc wheels here because we do a lot of fabrication, and those are a godsend for that. So, and then a nice sharp punch, small like that, but it's got to have a sharp edge on it. And I'll show you why here in a minute. And then a decent mallet hammer to pop those pins through. So I'm going to show you how to grind these posts off here, the ones that I've marked earlier, and the length that's marked X. So here we go. Alright, so I'm going to grind these 2 posts down. You want to grind them flat as you can. So now you can see that I've got that one link, and I've ground the pins completely flush with the outer link, and that's the key to our next step here. So now I'm going to put this in a vise. I'll be right back. Alright, so we've got our fixture set up for our chain. Now we're going to pop these pins through now that we've ground them flat with the outer link. I always use the flat side of the hammer so you have a less chance of hitting your hand. But you set your vise up so the pin has the ability to pop through. So sometimes it takes a little bit of time to get through. So you can feel it yielding through. I have soft jaws in this thing. They've popped through, so let me adjust here. Got this one coming through right now. There we go. So you can see there's one just poking through there, and hopefully you can see it. Now I'm going to do the outside one here. All it needs is a couple of good whacks. There we go. So now you can see how or why grinding makes a huge difference. There's no way you're going to pop it through because they mushroom out the outside of the pins so they don't break. So that's why I use the grinding wheel to flatten it out before you do it. And it's going to be a little hot. Alright guys, I'm going to put this chain on here. Now that it's cut the length, again, just kind of feed it through on the top of your chain guide there until it hits the counter sprocket, and then get it engaged in one of the teeth, and then it'll roll around for you. And I should mention that this whole process really crosses over to any motorcycles you can do. There's obviously different chains for street bikes and Harleys and whatnot. A lot of those guys use riveted on chains, but the guys that change their gearing quite a bit are typically using a traditional master link for ease of removal at the track. So this certainly applies to all of you motorcycle guys, but in this case we're talking dirt bikes. So we're feeding it through, and I always use this as a good holding point. So I guess it would be like 1 o'clock if this was noon, and it actually stays on quite nicely. And I'm gonna get my master link here, which is that guy. Put it through. Now we've got the chain captured. And resist the urge of wiping these off. They need to be lubed up, so you don't need to wipe them off. And you can see I've got the master link almost ready to go. And the most important part about putting a chain on is you want the alligator mouth, I call it, facing backwards to your drive direction. And the thought behind that is if you put it mouth forward, it could potentially catch something and come flying off and end your day real quick. So you want to make sure the alligator mouth is facing backwards. So now I've got the master link clip placed on there, and it stays by itself quite nicely. And I'm going to get a sharp corner on my pliers here and get this thing snapped on. Try to do it with one hand here. Just use the corner edge of your pliers. These don't always work. Alright, I had to change tools using needle nose now. Getting this guy on. There we go. So now you can see it's on all the way. The alligator side is open towards the back. I always like to give it a few taps just to make sure it's seated in. And a squeeze just to also make sure. And there you have it. Chain is cut and installed. So now we're gonna show you how to adjust it. We'll grab some tools, we'll be right back. Alright, so we're going to check our chain tension here. The way we do it on these KTM bikes is that you set it on the top of the swing arm here, and you measure by pushing up on the chain. And we are way out of spec. The spec is 2.17 to 2.3 inches. So we're gonna have to tighten this up a little bit. And how you achieve that is by adjusting these adjusters right here. So this is your jam nut here, and this is your adjuster bolt. So simply just by loosening this guy, you can actually see the chain moving up in its stroke. And you also want to keep moving from back side to side also, because you'll get a false reading if you don't. So just pay attention to about how many times you're adjusting it, and do it the same on both sides. Three. And we're checking. So I'm using, let's use the second notch. So we're almost at the third from the front on the second notch on this side. And we're not quite there on this side here, so I'm going to go out a little bit more. See where that puts us. And keep checking it with the tape measure. It'll be about the same. Typically KTMs look like the chains are loose, just the way they designed it. Even when they're within spec, they always look to me like they're loose. So that's like 2.5 right there. A little bit more. All right, my 10 mil. Run it out just a little more. And you want to allow for some chain stretch. Brand new chains do stretch. So now we're at the third mark from the back on the block, second groove on the swing arm. So now we're going to bring this guy out to the center of that groove on the swing arm, and we're going to check it again. And the best way to get a true reading on your adjuster marks is to put your least favorite screwdriver in these holes here and roll it back. And what this does is it puts tension on the chain and the sprocket, so it forces these adjusters to be honest, I call it. So now again, we're third mark on the block, second groove on the swing arm here, so that was accurate. Moving over to here, we're about the same there too. Third mark on the block, second groove on the swing arm. So let's take a measurement. And I should clarify that this screwdriver is just for making sure that the blocks are telling the truth. Sometimes you can have goo or gunk in there that'll actually warp your reading. So this is a good thing to do, just to make sure you got the right readings on both sides. So, but don't check your chain tension with that in there. So back to the tape measure. Bear with me, I am without a camera guy. So now we're at about 2.4, which is still a little too loose. If there was a chain that had already been ridden on, I would say leave it. But since it's going to stretch, it's going to get too loose. So we're going to go a little further here. Go back. I'm going to do the third mark in the back section of the swing arm. Second groove here. And same for this guy. Okay, so now we're again third mark, second groove on the frame, and then the back portion of that groove on the swing arm. Let's get a good check it again. I know this seems tedious, but hey, you know, this could mean the life of your chain lasting a long time or not. So we're getting an accurate reading here. And an accurate reading here as well. So let's check that tension again. Perfect. So that's right at like 2.2. So I think I'm going to live with that for this next ride. Okay. So now what we're going to do is lock this guy into place using that screwdriver again. And what this is going to do is going to allow you to back your adjuster until you feel like there's tension basically, and then you're going to run this lock nut down, and it's time to tighten that guy. Be careful with these guys, they will round off if you don't have your wrench all the way engaged. Okay, now we get the adjuster locked in on the left side, leaving that screwdriver in. Keep everybody honest. Backing that guy in there. Tightening those guys down. And now second to last thing we're going to do is torque that axle nut. I'm going to grab my torque wrench and set it to 59 foot-pounds. We'll be right back. Alright, so it's time to tighten up that axle nut. As you can see, I still have my screwdriver in between the chain and the sprocket there. That's actually keeping the axle back, and it's actually also keeping it forward against the adjusters. So I've got my torque wrench set to 59 foot-pounds. Check your bike manual, for whichever steed you are working on. They obviously vary from manufacturer to manufacturer. And going to the torque spec. And as I always say, sneak up on it. Don't do like they do in the movies and crank on it and expect it to be accurate. Feel that. Do it twice. Now we are set. And make sure you back your torque wrench off every single time you use it. Now I can roll that back out, take my screwdriver out, and always have a good look at the back of your chain and make sure you have a straight edge that you can put on this guy, just to ensure that the chain is in fact straight. And it looks like we're pretty darn straight. So last thing I got to do here is tighten up my counter sprocket bolt, and I will be right back. Just get a socket. Give me 1 second. Alright, on the last step to installing our drive set here, I did have to remove this guy and clean the threads again because I put it on yesterday and I didn't torque it yesterday because we had that snag with the wheel spacer. So I've removed it, cleaned it, and now I'm going to retorque this guy. If you don't have a buddy, I'm going to show you how to do it by yourself. So I've got my torque wrench set to 74 foot-pounds according to the service manual. And I'm going to go over here on the right side of the bike so I can step on the brake. It's also in gear just to give me a little assistance as well. So I'm going to go get this guy seated in. Make sure this is the right socket. Again, everything's metric on these bikes. It's always better to have a buddy, but we'll get it. There we go. There's two. Okay. So, just wanted to thank you guys for watching this channel. We're total newbies at it, but we're just like everyone else, just trying to make it work and get by without having anybody else that we have to depend on. So again, thanks for watching. We really appreciate each and every one of you. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with a friend. And if anybody has any comments, put them down below. We would certainly appreciate it. Thanks for watching. Take care.